Today's sponsor decided to bail on me last minute, so instead this video is brought to you by me and my Patreon, and my YouTube member page. For just $5 a month, you can get access to this video 3 days early and more. So click the link in the description to find out more, and thank you so much to the patrons for supporting this video. Greatness from small beginnings. It's a phrase that is repeated on more than a few occasions throughout Uncharted Drakes Fortune, and poetically, it serves as a phrase that can be applied to the game as a whole within the context of the series. With each entry being greater than the last, and with the quality gap between Uncharted 1 and 2 being as colossal as it is, it's no surprise that the series' humble beginnings doesn't receive a lot of love these days. This doesn't come as a surprise because the future Uncharted games are, while not immune to criticism, praised to near infinity, and in my eyes for good reason. Since Uncharted 2, the first of the series I had played, I had been hooked and loved the third and fourth entries to the series, so much so that I want to begin a marathon of sorts to give my thoughts on the whole franchise. But before we get into what will hopefully be some gushing reviews of the creme de la creme of this series, we need to start from the beginning. Now, according to a poll that was posted a while back, Drake's Fortune isn't at the top of many people's lists, but many of you also clarified that the game isn't necessarily bad by any means. It actually reminded me a lot of the Arkham series, as Arkham Asylum is seen as the worst, but not because the game is bad. It's great, actually, but because its sequels are so much better. Asylum was released in 2009, but it was surprisingly almost 4 years earlier that Naughty Dog began work on Uncharted, as in 2005 they decided to take a new approach to development and their games. Being well known for the Crash Bandicoot and Jak games that were stylized to something like a cartoon, attempting to transition to realistic humanized games would prove to be difficult. Making such a large pivot development-wise was something Naughty Dog was aware of, and as such they titled this new project Big. A big game for a big jump in technology. With the 7th generation of consoles on the horizon, games were no longer prohibited from making realistic art styles by the hardware, and while plenty of games still went for a stylized look, Project Big wanted to plant itself somewhere between the two. Upon first being shown at E3 2006, it was immediately compared to the ever-popular Tomb Raider games, and was promptly dubbed Dude Raider on internet forums. Of course, the Tomb Raider games focus far more on puzzles than Uncharted, though Uncharted eventually shifted to focusing more on puzzles and exploration, and I'd argue the Uncharted games and the reboot Tomb Raider games did a bit more than share test answers, if you know what I'm saying, but that's for another video. The point is, Uncharted, while not a wildly new concept for a game, was definitely Uncharted Territory for the Naughty Dog team, and thankfully this new direction paid off. Uncharted Drakes Fortune sold quite well and was received even better, with many critics citing its production quality, score, voice acting, level of detail, and set pieces as its strengths, but did acknowledge that some of the game's vehicle segments overstayed their welcome. Trust me, we will talk about that later. And the game did so well that it launched Naughty Dog to the forefront of AAA development for the 7th generation, spawning the aforementioned sequels. With such an interesting story and history tied to this game, it warrants taking a look back at Uncharted Drakes Fortune 14 years later. And just a warning, spoilers ahead. Uncharted is a good-looking game, though I don't think I'm in the minority of believing that the game's stylistic potential wasn't fully realized until future entries. The game's textures look great for the time, and the remastered touch-ups are nice. Some blemishes still show, as scenes with an open ocean look like the same bump map is repeated every yard or so, but the characters look great, and the gunplay, while with today's standards aren't anything special technically, it still does the job more than well enough. But I couldn't help feeling like this technical ability and production quality was misused. We trudged through so many mud and crud-filled forests, and almost the entire third act of the game takes place within caves and underground ruins. Not only does that further enforce the Dude Raider title the game had received, but in general it felt very generic. It seemed like it was just imitating the likes of popular action flicks like Indiana Jones, and that's down to the base premise of an everyman going on a treasure hunt, although it might be important to consider that perhaps that was the point. Uncharted is by all means an action film, told through the medium of a video game. I know that a phrase like that can seem vague, so to further clarify, I'll point to the many explosive vehicles, collapsing buildings, and moments where Nate barely escapes danger, be that a fall, a bad guy, or a shotgun in the face. All while these intense events are unfolding, Drake continues to deliver charming one-liners, and while that is indicative of his familiarity with the lifestyle of a modern-day treasure hunter, if not pirate, from another angle it looked like Naughty Dog was wearing their influences on their sleeve. I appreciate the way Uncharted lays its cards on the table, because it allowed me to play the game with the same mindset I would have when watching a dumb Hollywood blockbuster. This doesn't mean I went into this game with my brain off. I still paid ample attention to the story, and we will talk about that later, but I also made sure to do another playthrough where I just finished some collectible cleanup and decided to just go brain dead for a bit and enjoy the action. I think this is one of Uncharted's biggest strengths. If you pay attention, there's fun characters and a level of detail that most of the time rewards the player for taking a closer look at things. If you don't, well, you just see some average Joe that you can easily project yourself onto getting into crazy gunfights, which by the way look great and sound great too. The set pieces in which these fights take place are usually pretty indistinguishable from one another, as they often have an overabundance of green leaves or gray bricks, though there are some interesting twists. One sees you in a church, another on the back of a truck where you can shoot trees which will cause them to fall over, and even a shootout occurs on a jet ski, and while the gameplay is only mildly infuriating, the fidelity and visual aspect of it is great. I do wish that the game had a greater range of sets for our main characters to play in, but I think the selection here for a game that came out in 2007 is great, and even to this day it's acceptable in my eyes. My only real criticism is that I felt the underground Nazi base felt very disconnected from the rest of the game, to the point where speaking the sentence aloud feels like a shitpost. There were other things that caused this environmental whiplash, as the enemies here were unlike any we had faced before, and we had to use an entirely different fighting style to defeat them with guns from World War II. To be fair though, what's a Western action flick without a bad guy that's either German or Russian? The Germans' involvement in the plot is also hinted at earlier in the story as you explore a U-boat that is stuck near the edge of a waterfall, and this is just one of the claustrophobic interiors which have the camera stilted and mounted to a corner as Nathan stumbles his way through. And I use the word stumble intentionally. Nathan Drake is meant to be an average Joe, and his animations reflect this. He stumbles quite a bit and is often seen tripping over things, and not to an extent where he isn't taken seriously, but to enough of an extent to stop him from being seen as a flawless killing machine. When being shot at while running, he ducks and cowers haphazardly, and he visibly flinches when getting shot at behind cover. When he does actually get shot at, he jerks in the appropriate direction, and it adds to the realism of the game. Something interesting about this game is that Nathan dies in one shot. He can take a few punches, sure, but you'll always be greeted with a game over upon getting shot. Now, if you're familiar with the game, then you know I'm bullshitting here. Hell, the footage itself shows Nathan getting shot at, but according to Naughty Dog, Nathan's health bar, which is represented by the saturation of the screen, is actually his luck. If Nathan dies in 5 shots, it means he barely missed 4 of them through luck, and by the 5th shot, his luck has run out and he's taking that fatal blow. I like this because it's an easy explanation for how many bullets this guy can chew on when on easier difficulties, and it plays into the classic action movie trope of the hero getting extremely lucky. My only issue with this lies in the way it's presented. When you take damage, the game slowly loses its vibrance, and eventually, when you basically have one foot in the grave, the screen is entirely black and white. Before I criticize this, I should mention that I understand why Naughty Dog did this. If the game is going to present a cinematic experience, the first thing that would pull you out of your immersion is a heads-up display with a mini-map, ammo indicator, health bar, and God knows what else. I believe this is why there's no map, and the heads-up display elements are as minimalistic as it gets. The issue that arises here is, especially on harder difficulties, your vision during shootouts will be washed out far more than it isn't. For example, take a really awesome scene where Nate is on the back of a vehicle with a turret. Notice how despite me shooting the enemies almost immediately upon their spawn, I'm taking a hit. And while I don't mind taking a hit, I was sitting there consistently in this black and white tone and missing out on the vibrant visuals accompanying this setting. Now, my issue with the criticism I just provided is that I cannot think of a solution for this within what the game already has. How do we indicate player health while not impeding on the cinematic elements of the game? I don't really think you can. There might be some way we can incorporate the health bar in a way that is attached to Nathan's character model in the same way Dead Space does, but anything that is too subtle could mean that the player loses track of their health, and if it's too in your face, it could be more distracting than a potential health bar in the top left corner. Let me know if you have any ideas for a way to work this in. Since we are on the topic of character models, I'd like to mention that the designs for the main characters were memorable. Sully and Elena have iconic designs, as does our main character, and while the enemies you fight never leave the realm of generic pirate or generic military personnel, they don't need to be anything more, as they serve as an infinite wave of extras that populate the different scenes of this game. The scenes in question usually see you making use of either gunplay or climbing, both of which are quite simple, and while they have certainly benefited from the different innovations the sequels brought, they still get the job done here. I I would consider the core gameplay mechanics here to be pretty bare bones and don't really do anything to innovate. There's a good chance though that this was an intentional decision. Though it doesn't excuse its minimalistic approach, it serves as a scaffolding of sorts that props up the set pieces of the game. So while I look at the gameplay in a vacuum, do remember that most of the criticisms aren't as noticeable when everything is in motion. For example, there is a pretty slim selection of weapons, but that doesn't really matter. You have a shotgun, a pistol, a few assault rifles, and SMGs, a sniper, a grenade launcher, but because of how ammo in this game is structured, you'll be scrounging around for ammo so often that you'll naturally make use of all of these weapons through scarcity alone. I think the balance for the weapons here is good, and in fact the only weapon I'd say is unbalanced is the MP40, which just shreds most enemies, but it's introduced so late into the game and balanced out by the increasing enemy damage and population that it works as a way to turn you into a glass cannon and doesn't overstay its welcome. The gunplay is cover-based, which I never enjoyed much, but most encounters on most difficulties can be rushed through if your aim is tight enough. Unfortunately, I found that this was one of the most clunky aiming controls I've used in a while. I didn't experience this in any other Uncharted game, and especially not in the 4th installment, and I imagine this is just a product of its time. You will get used to it, but it might be jarring for the first couple of hours. Regardless, headshots will be invaluable throughout most of the game, and especially on brutal and crushing difficulty, you'll find yourself having no room for error. The cover itself works like you imagined, though there were a few points where enemies were shooting through walls and hitting Drake despite him being behind cover, and it didn't happen enough to be a major issue, but transferring between cover was a little wonky at times, and I typically found it less troublesome to just exit cover and re-enter it after walking a few steps over. Your enemies can of course take cover too, and they even take different approaches to it, with some peeking out like normal, and the more nimble foes taking lower exit points being borderline prone, which spiced up the combat a bit more. Enemies will also act differently based on what guns they have, with shotgun-wielding foes rushing you and snipers hanging back. Simple stuff, but the game often throws everything in the kitchen sink at you, and I never felt the gunplay was unfair or overwhelming, and at most it's just overstimulating, but in a good way. A playstyle and enemy I've avoided talking about up to this point is the run and gunning and the Descendants. The Descendants are these demonic humans that have been corrupted by this game's antagonistic curse of El Dorado. They move quickly, rush you down, and hit like a semi. I like these guys a lot because they turn the normal gunplay on its head, and while run and gun isn't perfect, it is reliable enough to deal with these guys. When running and gunning, you get a wider crosshair, and when an enemy is near that crosshair, most of the bullets will hit them, even if you are just barely aiming at them. This makes up for the lack of precision that comes with the shooting and the controls. I think the only time these enemies can be a pain is when they're mixed in with the human enemies who are best dealt with whilst behind cover, but even that has a solution. Fortunately, the human enemies and the Descendants will automatically aggro each other, so the solution to dealing with the mixed enemies is to kill the Descendants first and then deal with the humans like usual, or wait a few years for them to kill each other, but come on, that's boring. You can also melee enemies with light and heavy attacks, but I genuinely found no use for this as they do barely any damage compared to guns, and a majority of fights are taking place behind covers, so you won't really have an opportunity to get up close and personal. Whenever you're not pumping enemies full of lead, you'll be climbing some sort of unstable surface. The climbing in itself is simple, as it just sees you pressing X to jump from one ledge to another ledge, and pressing circle to drop to a ledge. I found the drop to ledge mechanic super finicky though, because sometimes Drake would drop down like he's supposed to, and other times he would hilariously roll off to his death. I ended up just gambling every time I needed to drop down, which was pretty annoying at times. Fortunately, that's the worst that the climbing has to offer, and unfortunately, there isn't much else to offer. The climbing always sees you moving from a stable cliff face, pipe, or ledge to an unstable one, which means you have to quickly jump to the next, and while this does create tension cinematically, it never translated to gameplay very well. In fact, I never felt any sense of danger in the climbing because it's borderline impossible to unintentionally fail, excluding the ledge drop mechanic. Since you can virtually never make a mistake in the platforming, it has little tension or agency, and once you realize that, the climbing can become tedious. The falling platforms mentioned before add to this, as it seems like every climbable object is going to give away, and the first time it happens you think, oh, I better get a move on, but by the 100th time you find yourself more surprised when a pipe does actually hold your weight. The gunplay and climbing also barely intersect, which is unfortunate, but they function well as an excuse to get Nate from one scene to the next. Unfortunately, from a design perspective, the levels here are pretty bare bones and skeletal. It's usually just a room with some boxes that act as cover, and while I don't think my expectations are that high, I would have liked to see more dynamic environments. I wish I had more to talk about, but all the levels here just follow the same structure of an open square room with boxes for cover. Of course, in a treasure hunting adventure such as this, there are bound to be puzzles, and they function more as a roadblock than anything else. The major issue with the puzzles here is that the answer is almost always given to you from the start. Nate has his ancestor, Sir Francis Drake's journal, which will help him solve the many puzzles leading to El Dorado. And by help, I mean the work is done for you. One of the first is just pulling levers in the right order, like it's labeled. The puzzle is already solved, and to add to that, actually completing the solution is tedious. Every time you pull said lever, the camera has to zoom out and present the changes in the room to you, and considering that you have to jump from platform to platform, the tedium just gets turned up to 11. You could write this off because it's the first puzzle in the game. Fortunately, the next puzzle sees you turning statues to face a particular direction. The notepad again tells you which way to turn the statues as they are labeled by their cardinal directions, though it doesn't have an anchor point, meaning there will be some trial and error. It is unfortunately another instance where the game gives you the answer to a puzzle and makes the completion of the puzzle unnecessarily lengthy and uninteresting. While it is pretty unambitious, it's another beginner puzzle. Except it's not, I lied. The puzzle is about halfway through the game. The puzzles are consistently uninteresting and lack any sort of challenge. And you guys know I'm a fucking idiot on a good day, and what leaves me even further slack-jawed is that these puzzles have been praised. Allow me to give way too much credit here and cite thegamer.com's list of the top 10 puzzles in the Uncharted series, which just seems like they have had a list of puzzles picked at random, and they listed a puzzle I haven't discussed yet that appears in chapter 16. There are 22 chapters in the game, so this is a fair ways in. The puzzle they refer to involves some Roman numerals, and I didn't even consider this a puzzle because it took such a small amount of effort. You enter this room with a bunch of different paths, and each path has a sign with a Roman numeral. If you open your notebook, it'll tell you that the numbers 2, 5, and 7 mark the safe path, and everything else will lead to a trap. Now, not only does the map on hand literally tell you where to go, but there was a point halfway through where I just straight up forgot what the numbers were and just went on whatever path looked like it was safe, and it worked out. So please, tell me in the comments, what am I missing? Because this is listed as the second best puzzle in the entire series, and while I know that a random gaming article does not speak for the majority, I cannot for the life of me figure out where this is coming from. To summarize, there are puzzles here, but the solutions are given to you immediately, so there is no mental work for the player. I'm not saying that we need complex brain teasers or that we need to do fucking algebra 3 to get through a locked door, but for an example of what puzzles worked, look no further than some of the puzzles in the sequels. Since I'm already kinda tilted, I may as well lean further into it and talk about the vehicle sections. There are a few moments where Nate is on a vehicle and shooting some targets, while another character drives. One of these I mentioned involving the truck, and one I left out was one where Elena and Nate are on a jet ski, and we have to both drive and shoot. But get this, you can't do both at the same time. That, and there are a ton of enemies shooting you at once as they cover the surrounding buildings, so you have to make sure to drive a bit, shoot them with a grenade launcher, drive a bit, and so on. But there are also red explosive barrels that are in the water and need to be blown up, and despite being within close proximity of each other, these barrels will not blow each other up. On normal or even hard difficulties, this is annoying and definitely a low point of the game, but on crushing difficulty, it was actually maddening. Fortunately, these sections aren't too long and the checkpoints are pretty reasonable, but god, this sucked, and I'm so glad there is not another set piece like this throughout the entire series. There is also a boss fight in the game that I may as well mention because it was pretty lame, but nowhere near as bad as the jet ski, just for a comparison. You have an enemy that pops up, fires a few shots at you, and when he's reloading, you kill the goons surrounding him, and after clearing a wave, he moves farther to the back of the boat, and you just rinse and repeat this a couple of times. I think this is pretty lame because you are forced to play this the way the game wants you to. If you move to cover when you're not supposed to, you die, and near instantly too. You know you are safe as long as you are behind cover, so when the boss is shooting at you, there is no tension because he, in a rhythmic fashion, shoots and reloads. It was really easy, but there's nothing too offensive about it. The fight does end with a quick time event, and there are a few points where QTEs are used in the game. I think the QTEs here are fine as they are never intrusive and don't replace the action set pieces, and they also fit in with the theme of this being a linear interactive movie. While heading off the beaten path and gameplay is usually heavily discouraged, there are a number of collectible treasures for you to find. These are never too hard to find and were more of a distraction than anything, but upon completing the game and finding these collectibles, you get access to different bonuses. Slow motion mode, game filters, character model swaps, all the fun stuff, and I absolutely love when a game does this. Overall, the different gameplay mechanics here are really basic and clunky, but I think they come together under the greater set pieces and the presentation to form a product that is greater than the sum of its parts. While there aren't a ton of abilities to make use of, the game gives you mostly interesting and high-octane backdrops that easily make you forget how bare-bones the gameplay is. I think that's an important distinction to make here too. The gameplay on its own isn't that great, but when in motion, it is a great time. If you try to analyze the gameplay here and look at it critically, you'll see the cracks in the foundation, but if you just take everything for what it is and enjoy the ride, you'll be satisfied by the end of the journey. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on who you are, the story follows the same suit. While the story here certainly has its value, it's only gold-plated, as once you look closer you see there are a lot of inconsistencies and oversights. But that doesn't mean the game can't be enjoyed by just not looking beneath the surface. The game opens with a sarcophagus of Sir Francis Drake being raised from the ocean and by none other than Nathan Drake, a descendant of Francis.
Well, I did do my research, and apparently Francis Drake didn't have any children.
Well, history can't be wrong, you know.
Nathan is on a boat with Elena Fisher, a reporter who, in exchange for funding Nathan's expedition, will get an exclusive look at the coffin for her news show. They are interrupted by pirates that begin shooting the pair, and while this is nothing new for Nathan, Elena certainly isn't familiar with firefights.
What's worse?
You obviously haven't been in a Panamanian jail. Do you know how to use one of these?
Fortunately, the veteran cigar-smoking treasure hunter Victor Sullivan is right around the corner with a seaplane that is able to scoop up both Nate and Elena, but not before Nate can secure the notebook of Sir Francis Drake, which has a map that leads to El Dorado, the city of gold. Once docked, Sully and Nate realize that any potential reporting could draw a hell of a lot more eyes to this treasure, so they feel that it's best to ditch Elena. As Sully and Nate continue their search, they come across a tomb that reveals that El Dorado isn't a city, but a sarcophagus of sorts that has been moved from its original resting place. Issue is, Sully has landed himself in some pretty heavy debt and needs the potential riches from this expedition to clear his debts. As they continue to explore, they come across an abandoned German U-boat that contains a map leading them to a different island. Before Nate investigates, he leaves Sully with Francis Drake's journal. As Drake leaves, Sully's debt collector, Roman, catches up to him and decides that he wants the treasure for himself rather than whatever debt Sully owed. Roman then kills Sully with a shot to the heart. Nate, with little time to mourn, runs into Elena, who caught up with him, and the two escape in a car and eventually by plane before crash landing on the island containing El Dorado. Nate makes his way to an old fort to catch up with Elena, but is captured and eventually saved by Elena. As the two recuperate, Nate decides that he wants to back out, but Elena convinces him to continue forward, and they eventually find Sullivan being held by Roman and seemingly working with him. As the two meet up with Sully, they find out that Sir Francis Drake's journal took the bullet that hit Sully, and he's been leading Roman on a wild goose chase to keep him away from the treasure. Sully continues his undercover work, then Elena and Nate eventually get separated while Nathan meets up with his captor from the fort, Eddie Raja, and the two have to team up to defeat these new descendants that end up killing Eddie. After this, Elena and Nate discover the body of Sir Francis Drake and realize that he never got to the treasure, and this hits Drake pretty hard. As they continue forward, they end up in an older German World War II bunker. When getting split up again, Nate discovers that the descendants are actually humans infected with a curse that is housed inside the golden idol. El Dorado isn't a treasure, it's a curse. As Nathan returns to Elena, it's revealed that she had been captured by Roman, and Nate is then able to regroup with Sully, but they are too late. And Roman opens El Dorado, immediately turning into a descendant and being shot by his sidekick, Navarro. Navarro then reveals that he knew about the curse and that the gold which holds the curse has no value when compared to the curse held inside, if sold to the right buyer. Sully and Nate break free, and Nate chases Navarro to a boat with Elena, and he takes him down with a QuickTime event. As they are about to leave, Sully shows up with a literal boatload of gold, and the three make their way back home, and that's where our story ends. So right off the bat, you probably noticed a lot of inconsistencies, and that's okay. I think getting the not so good stuff out of the way first is the best move, because there is a lot to love about this story, but unfortunately there's a lot of things holding the plot back. Let's at least acknowledge the minor quirks, such as, how did Elena track Sully and Nate down after she is stranded on an island? How did she know where they were going? How did she get the proper tools to get to them? Why would Sully and Nate leave Elena on an island after almost getting killed by pirates? Like, how is that at all morally correct? Don't get me wrong, there's a disconnect because Nate kills thousands by the end of a playthrough in gameplay, but that never really bothered me because it was in gameplay, and any killing that's done in the cutscenes was done in self-defense, more or less. But stranding Elena just seems strange. Why does Nate just not really care about Sully being dead? And I understand he has bigger problems at hand, but even during downtime, he really doesn't show signs of grief, despite knowing him for decades. Also, why doesn't Nate not trust Sully when the two have known each other for so long? He sees one video of him with Roman and just assumes that he's working with him. Maybe they just didn't think about it because this is the first game and Sully's involvement with Nate isn't clearly explained until the third game? I don't know. Anywho, the point is there are a few little oversights, but they never got in the way of my enjoyment personally. That enjoyment also never came from the overarching plot, but rather the interactions with the characters. Nate and Sully's banter is a ton of fun, and it does a great job of filling in the downtime. Even during gunfights, Nate won't stop quipping, but I never felt he overdid it. It was just the right amount of cheese for me. Whether it's talking about finding a bride in a brothel, or about a Panamanian jail, there's always something mildly interesting that warrants listening to with both Nate and Sully, and Nate and Elena.
Getting out.
All right, Nate, just pretend for a minute that I don't really care about any of that stuff and cut to the chase, would you?
Man only interested in the climax. You must be a real hit with the ladies.
Never had any complaints.
Okay then, I'll jump to the good part, just for you.
Going back to the oversights, there were a few larger decisions that pulled me out of my experience, such as when Navarro gets the drop on Drake. Drake just turns his back to the guy with the shotgun, who doesn't try to shoot him at all, by the way, and musters the strength to push a helicopter overboard, and somehow Navarro is standing in the perfect spot for his leg to get caught in a rope, and it's like, okay, now you're really pushing it. And just to add to this, Sully then shows up and says, yeah, I killed 2 people and made out with this gold. Like, I understand that much like the action flicks this game is based on, there will be extreme cases of luck, and some suspension of disbelief is required, but I felt that all of this back-to-back made it hard to just not think about. While Sully and Nate are more than acquainted long before the events of the game, Nate and Elena are a pair that were consistently growing on each other and myself. At the beginning of the game, they don't really trust each other and are quite cold in the way Nate refuses to let her film Francis Drake's journal and actively asks for the camera to be out of his face, but by the end of the game, he's totally on board.
Yeah, I'm afraid this is as close as we're getting to El Dorado.
Drake also comes pretty close to having a moment of reflection when he discovers Francis Drake's body, but the game doesn't go very far with it. His idol, who he's looked up to for supposedly a very long time, is just laying there with his goal of finding El Dorado left unaccomplished. This, for some time, crushed Drake, but then we find out that Francis Drake wasn't searching for El Dorado, but rather trying to hide it, which recontextualizes the internal struggle and basically solves it. I wouldn't have minded seeing a greater look at this for Drake, as it could make him more than a wisecracking action hero, but he does get the chance to show off his determination. Of course, Drake isn't the only one to evolve in the game, as his semi-love interest gets some growth too. Elena at the beginning of the game acts as a great stand-in for the player, asking the reasonable questions like, are we going to call the authorities? How did these people find us? And it's clear that this treasure hunting life is both an unfamiliar and uncomfortable thing for her. Meanwhile, Drake is borderline accustomed to it. As the game goes on though, she becomes very much desensitized to the sight of bodies, to the point where her first reaction to seeing a dead body in a trap is thinking, I wish I had my camera.
That's disgusting. Oh, I wish I had my camera.
She even convinces Drake to continue when he feels like backing out, and I like this scene a lot.
Fine. It's me, okay? I am quitting. Are you coming or not?
So that's it. You're just gonna forget about the treasure and forget about Drake?
God damn it, this is not worth dying over.
Okay. Listen, either way, we have to head back to the harbor. Don't worry about it. We can argue about it later. It'll be great.
At the beginning of the game, Drake is the one initiating the exploring and saving Elena, but on far more occasions throughout the game, once Elena is all in, she's the one doing the saving and pushing forward, even when shooting a grenade launcher with one hand on the back of a jet ski. Elena is a strong female character that is a badass without feeling pandering or disingenuous. She has similar flaws to Drake in that they both get way too caught up in this treasure hunt, and her reliance on her camera is, as someone who makes videos, genuinely relatable on a slightly embarrassing level. Her chemistry with Drake is also great, and I'm very happy with the foundation for their relationship that carries over to the other games. The villain Roman was not my favorite. He serves as the basic rich, greedy villain, but I think what makes it worse is that Navarro just comes in as the main villain after Roman dies, and it just felt really disjointed. There's a few scenes with the two that justify Navarro's motivation to want Roman dead, but I still felt that it could have been better if Navarro's transition from sidekick to main villain was smoother and perhaps more telegraphed. I also like Eddie Raja a lot, but I felt his significance of the plot was pretty well non-existent. I feel like Navarro could have easily filled his shoes in the fort, and it would have made him more prominent in the story as a whole. Though I did like Eddie far more than Navarro. I think the twist with El Dorado being a curse was good enough, and hot take incoming, I think the Descendants tonally fit fine. I think this is because a supernatural twist is added in every Uncharted game, and it's a decent enough way of raising the stakes. Though I do admit that the whole World War II German bunker was a lot. While the game certainly follows this theme of being a dumb action plot, it's not like it lacks any nice details. The game's opening scene shows a stone coffin being raised from the ocean, and the game's closing scene shows a golden sarcophagus being drowned in the ocean. Both the opening and closing scenes take place on a boat, and the game seems to go to pretty great lengths to check off all the cliches of an action blockbuster, though as mentioned, a ledge breaking away or a bridge collapsing is so common that it almost gets tiring. Almost. I think the story overall works fine. It wasn't any masterclass in character writing, nor was it as memorable as the other game's stories, but it did what it needed to, and it gave the player a consistent excuse to keep going. I think that sentiment is shared throughout the entire game too. This idea of not necessarily doing anything exceptional in its field, but doing everything good enough to justify the price of admission. Uncharted Drakes Fortune is the embodiment of the very phrase that is shown at the beginning of the game, as if Naughty Dog knew that this game would spawn sequels marginally better than their predecessors, and as if they knew that this game wasn't the ceiling. It's like a meta commentary. That's not to say this game is bad though, in fact I liked it a lot. I think this game's biggest weakness though is just how bad it looks compared to every other game in the series, which improved upon every facet while also making the set pieces even more over the top. The story was simple, the presentation was good, but it felt repetitive as you trudged through way too many muddy forests. And the gameplay was definitely clunky, but it still worked, and considering the time this game came out, I'm actually surprised it holds up as much as it does. That's something I have to clarify too. This game, considering the time it came out, is great, but it doesn't really hold a candle to the games of today, and that's expected. I mentioned that this game to me is best enjoyed by turning your brain off, and maybe that's a poor choice of words, but what I mean is that this game works best if you just don't question things too much. Don't worry about how Elena found Nate and Sully, or how a journal was able to stop a bullet, or how after being hit with said bullet, Sully just decided to lay there and pretend to be dead. Just sit back and enjoy the ride. I think this is why the game seems to have a bit of a divided player base. If you are someone who plays games for the challenge and mechanical depth, then I think this game is not going to satisfy you. But if you're looking for a laid-back experience, then you'll probably get the most out of it. In my personal opinion, not every game needs to be looked at as high art, and I don't mean that as a way of dismissing any criticism to this game, because I believe those criticisms are valid, but I also feel that the issues here don't prevent the game from being good, and more importantly, being enjoyable. But it does prevent it from reaching its full potential. I think Uncharted Drakes Fortune, while definitely the weak link of the series, is worth playing for at minimum seeing the beginning of what turned into a legendary series. I haven't played Uncharted 2 since its re-release on PS4 in 2015, and I am more than excited to see how much the series has improved since its humble beginnings. Hey boys, thank you so much for watching today's video. I really appreciate it. I just want to give a quick shout out to our YouTube members and our Patreon members. Remember guys, for just $5 a month, you can get access to this video a couple days early, some thumbnail sessions for this video's thumbnail, and you can see the 3 different drafts I had going into it, and so much more. There will be a link in the description to a full video that discloses and discusses everything that you will receive. And yeah, I really appreciate it. So thank you guys so much for your contributions. This was a lot of fun to edit. I don't know if this video will do very well. I don't imagine it will because it's outside of like my normal like niche. So after this video, I will be doing a Assassin's Creed Origins video, and the Batman Arkham ranking video is kind of on hold for a bit. I'm having some weird difficulties with it, but do not worry, it will happen eventually. The video is basically ready to go. I'm working out a couple of things with it. So yeah. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. And thank you again for the support you've shown over the past couple of months. I stopped talking about it because I felt like it got really repetitive and annoying, but I'm very grateful that we were able to reach my personal goal of 80,000 subscribers this year. And I mean, we're on pace to hit 90,000 before the end of the year as well. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to say. You can follow my Twitter down below. You can also subscribe to Nam's Compendium down below. And yeah, take care of yourselves. Stay safe, stay healthy. I love you guys, and I'll see you next time.